The moment I felt the new CFO's handshake told me everything I needed to know. Too firm, too practiced, the kind of grip they teach in business school seminars about projecting dominance. He looked right through me like I was furniture. Just another middle-aged woman in sensible shoes who probably handled paperwork and remembered birthdays. Never mind that I was the reason our last SEC audit came back clean. Never mind that I'd spent 20 years building the financial reporting systems that kept this bank from collapsing under its own complexity. His name was Preston Whitmore III. Yes, the third. Because apparently mediocrity is hereditary. He swept into the quarterly meeting with an entourage of junior analysts trailing behind him like baby ducks, following a particularly expensive mallard, Italian suit, Swiss watch, hair that probably had its own stylist. I sat in my usual corner, the same spot I'd occupied for 2 decades, holding the compliance reports he was too important to read before the meeting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to when Meridian Trust was still a regional savings and loan with more ambition than assets. The year was 2004. The financial world was about to implode, but nobody knew it yet. I was hired as a bookkeeper. That's what they called it back then. Someone to reconcile accounts, track transactions, make sure the numbers added up at the end of the day. Simple work for simple times. But here's the thing about being the bookkeeper in a growing bank. You see everything, every transaction, every transfer, every decision that looks brilliant on paper but smells like trouble if you know what to look for. The executives talked around me like I was part of the furniture. They discussed deals in the break room while I filled my coffee cup. They left sensitive documents on the printer while I collected my reports. They assumed the quiet woman with the calculator wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. I watched us nearly go under in 2008, watched the executives panic while I quietly identified which assets were toxic and which could save us. Nobody asked my opinion, of course. But I made sure the right reports landed on the right desks at the right time. We survived. Barely. And somewhere in that chaos, I became indispensable. My title evolved over the years. Bookkeeper became senior accountant, became financial systems manager, became director of regulatory compliance. The salary grew, the responsibilities multiplied. But the core never changed. I was the one who understood how the money actually moved. Not the theoretical models the MBAs built in their spreadsheets. The real flows, the legacy systems, the workarounds we'd created during every crisis that somehow became permanent. For 20 years, I was the institutional memory of Meridian Trust, the one who knew why certain accounts were structured certain ways, the one who remembered the handshake deals from 1997 that still affected our reporting, the one who could explain to auditors why our numbers were actually correct, even when they looked suspicious. The office smelled like old carpet and printer toner. The fluorescent lights buzzed a frequency that would drive you crazy if you listened. But I'd stopped noticing decades ago. This place was home. These systems were my life's work. If you've made it this far into my little confession, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Tap the like. I know we're all just scrolling through life half-conscious, but it helps the channel. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. It gets ugly. Now, where was I? Right. Preston Whitmore III, the new CFO who arrived like a hurricane in a Hugo Boss suit. Preston wasn't promoted from within Chimeon. He was imported, headhunted from a Wall Street firm that had paid $3 billion in fines for fraud, but somehow still operated because the executives had better lawyers than consciences. His father sat on our board. His grandfather had founded the investment bank that held 20% of our preferred shares. Preston didn't climb a ladder. He was lowered into position by a golden crane. The man had never worked at a regional bank in his life, never dealt with local regulators, never sat through a community reinvestment audit, never explained to a Federal Reserve examiner why a small bank in the Midwest did things differently than Goldman Sachs. But he had opinions, lots of opinions, about efficiency, about modernization, about how we were all doing everything wrong. He showed up his first day with a consulting team of 12 people. 12. For a bank our size. That's not an audit. That's an invasion. They wore matching lanyards and carried tablets loaded with software that cost more than some of our branch buildings. They walked through departments like tourists at a museum, pointing at things and taking notes without understanding what they were looking at. His title was Chief Financial Officer and Strategic Transformation Lead, which is corporate speak for I'm going to fire people and call it efficiency. The transformation part was especially ironic, considering he'd never transformed anything except his family's money into board seats. First week, he ordered a complete review of all departments, not to understand how things worked, to find things to cut. He carried a leather notebook everywhere, scribbling names and numbers like a grim reaper keeping score. Every afternoon, he'd meet with his consulting team in the glass conference room. They'd spread printouts across the table and circle things in red marker. I could see them from my desk. Red circles meant someone was losing their job. Second week, he eliminated the entire internal audit team. 17 people, gone. Most of them had been with us for over a decade. They knew our systems. They understood our quirks. They could spot a problem before it became a crisis. Preston replaced them with an outsourced firm from Chicago. The firm charged triple our internal costs and understood nothing about our specific regulatory requirements. They'd never dealt with our state banking commissioner. They'd never navigated our particular combination of federal and state oversight. They just had a methodology and a lot of confidence. Third week, he started talking about streamlining legacy operations, which meant anyone over 50 with institutional knowledge was suddenly a liability instead of an asset. We need fresh thinking, he announced at the leadership meeting. This bank has been operating like it's still 1995. We need to modernize, digitize, optimize. He pronounced optimize like it was a magic word that could solve any problem. Like you could just optimize away 20 years of complex financial relationships and regulatory accommodations. I sat in the corner, taking notes nobody would read, watching him gesture at slides filled with buzzwords and hockey stick projections. The numbers didn't add up. I could see it immediately. His models assumed growth rates that defied mathematics and regulatory requirements he clearly didn't understand. He was projecting revenue increases that would require us to violate lending limits. He was assuming cost savings that would gut our compliance capabilities. He was building a house of cards and calling it a castle, but nobody asked the compliance director what she thought. Nobody asked the woman who'd kept this bank legal for 2 decades if the new strategy made sense. I was just the old lady with the calculator in the corner. The first casualties were the senior relationship managers, the ones who knew our biggest depositors by name, the ones who could call a client and resolve a problem with a conversation instead of a form letter, the ones who remembered why certain accounts had special arrangements dating back to the 1990s. Margaret from private banking was the first to go. 31 years of service. She'd personally managed relationships worth $400 million in deposits. Preston called her role relationship overhead and gave her accounts to a call center in Phoenix. Then it was William from commercial lending. He'd been with us since before I started, knew every business owner in the Tri-County area, understood which loans were safe even when the numbers looked risky, because he knew the people behind the numbers. Preston replaced him with an algorithm. Preston called it strategic workforce right-sizing. I called it institutional lobotomy. You can't just delete 30 years of relationships from a balance sheet. Those people weren't expenses. They were assets, and Preston was liquidating them without understanding their value. My turn came on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. That's not how these things work. No security escort, no cardboard box. Just a calendar invite titled Organizational Alignment Discussion. 30 minutes, no agenda. The invite came at 2:15 p.m. Meeting scheduled for 4:30 p.m. Late enough that HR would be empty by the time we finished. A coward's move. I walked into the glass conference room knowing exactly what was coming. The walls were transparent, but the blinds were drawn. They didn't want witnesses. Preston sat at the head of the table with 2 HR representatives I'd never seen before. Brought in from corporate. Probably. Clean hands for dirty work. Our legal counsel was there too. Stephen, who I'd worked with for 15 years. He was staring at his tablet like it contained the secrets of the universe. Couldn't meet my eyes. The room smelled like new leather and old fear. Someone had placed a box of tissues on the table. Thoughtful. They expected tears. They wouldn't get them. "Patricia," Preston said, glancing at his notes. "It's Pauline," I corrected him. 20 years. And he'd never bothered to learn my name. The man responsible for our finances couldn't remember the name of the person who actually understood them. Right, right. He waved his hand dismissively. "Pauline, we're restructuring the compliance function. Your role is being transitioned to a consulting arrangement. Not fired. That would trigger severance calculations and regulatory notifications. Just transitioned. A word that sounds like evolution but means extinction. HR jumped in with the script. We value your years of service. This is about aligning our organizational structure with industry best practices. Your institutional knowledge is appreciated, but we need a more modern approach to compliance." Translation. You're old, you're expensive, and we've decided that understanding regulations is less important than appearing innovative. My title went from Director of Regulatory Compliance to nothing. 20 years of expertise, reduced to a consulting arrangement that would expire in 90 days. My office moved from the executive floor to a cubicle in the basement. Next to the boiler room, no window, no phone, just a desk and a computer with restricted access. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask what I'd done wrong. After 20 years of keeping a bank legal through 3 financial crises, you learn that showing emotion is just giving them ammunition. They want you to break down. They want you to beg. It justifies their decision. I simply stood, smoothed my blazer, and said 5 words. "Good luck with the audit." Preston's smile flickered. A crack in the facade. He didn't understand what I meant. None of them did. The Federal Reserve examination was scheduled for next quarter. A comprehensive review of our compliance systems, our reporting accuracy, our regulatory adherence, the kind of audit that could result in fines measured in hundreds of millions, or worse. I'd been preparing for it for 18 months, building the documentation, organizing the evidence, creating the narrative that would satisfy the regulators. That preparation lived in my head, in my files, in systems I'd built that nobody else understood. They were about to face a federal examination with a compliance function run by consultants who'd never seen our specific regulatory history. Good luck indeed. Here's what Preston Whitmore III didn't understand about Meridian Trust's compliance infrastructure. It wasn't a department. It was an archaeological site. Layers upon layers of regulatory accommodations built over 2 decades. Special arrangements with state regulators from the 2008 crisis. Federal Reserve agreements from the 2012 review. Consumer protection commitments from the 2010 settlement. Each layer had its own documentation requirements, its own reporting schedules, its own institutional memory. I was that memory. Our quarterly reporting alone required reconciliation across 17 different systems. 3 of them were legacy platforms from banks we'd acquired in the 1990s. 2 of them ran on code so old that the original programmers had retired or died. One of them was maintained by a contractor in Cleveland who only worked Tuesdays and Thursdays because he was semi-retired and liked fishing. The database architecture was a monument to crisis management. We had 4 different customer information systems that were supposed to synchronize, but actually just coexisted in a state of negotiated peace. Data flowed through validation layers I'd designed to catch inconsistencies before they reached the regulators. Layers nobody else knew existed because they worked silently, invisibly, perfectly. And then there was the Federal Reserve reporting system, the crown jewel of my 20 years. After the 2008 crisis, the Fed had required us to implement enhanced monitoring, real-time reporting, automated alerts, the kind of surveillance that would catch problems before they became catastrophes. I'd built that system myself, spent 3 years designing it, coded half of it personally because we couldn't afford proper developers. It was elegant, effective, completely undocumented. The system required manual certification every month. A digital signature from exactly one authorized account. My account. The account they deactivated when they transitioned me to consultant status. I didn't plan this. I need you to understand that. I didn't build traps or plant time bombs. I didn't sabotage systems or create dependencies designed to punish anyone who let me go. I just did my job for 20 years in a way that made me essential. And then they tried to make me unnecessary. The irony is beautiful in a terrible way. They pushed out the relationship managers because they were expensive. They eliminated the compliance director because she was old. They optimized the workforce to look lean and modern for the board. And in doing so, they created a single point of failure called Pauline Marchetti. The Federal Reserve certification was due on the 1st of next month. My account wouldn't be there to authorize it. And then everything Preston Whitmore III didn't understand would become devastatingly clear. The first sign of trouble came at 7:23 a.m. on a Monday, December 1st, certification day. I know because I got a text from Denise in operations, one of the few people who still talk to me. Something's wrong with the Fed reporting system. It's rejecting all submissions. Preston is screaming at everyone. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee that actually tasted good for once because I wasn't rushing to an office that didn't want me. The morning light came through my window, soft and gray. December in the Midwest. My cat watched me from his perch on the radiator, completely uninterested in banking crises. I read the message, took another sip, and didn't respond. By 9 a.m., the situation had escalated. The Federal Reserve reporting portal was showing error codes nobody had seen before. Authorization failed. Certification expired. System access suspended pending review. By 10 a.m., they'd received the first call from the Fed, a polite inquiry about why their monthly certification hadn't been submitted, the kind of polite that carries the weight of regulatory authority behind it. Preston called an emergency meeting. I know because Denise kept texting me updates like she was reporting from a war zone. He's blaming it. Says they must have broken something during the upgrade. They hadn't. I knew exactly what had happened. The system had tried to run its monthly certification. My account wasn't there to authorize it. The system did what it was designed to do when authorization failed. It locked everything down and notified the regulator. Exactly what you want when you suspect fraud. Exactly what you don't want when you've just fired the only person who can explain it. The beauty of good compliance design is that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're an external threat or an internal idiot. Unauthorized access is unauthorized access. And without my credentials, the entire reporting infrastructure was unauthorized. By noon, they'd called in the consulting firm that had replaced my team. Bright young things in expensive suits who specialized in financial technology transformation. They took one look at our systems and asked where the documentation was. There wasn't any. I was the documentation. By 3 p.m., those consultants had called in their own specialists. The first team specialized in regulatory reporting. The second team specialized in legacy system integration. Neither team had ever seen architecture quite like ours, because I'd built it to survive crises, not to be pretty. By 6 p.m., someone finally figured out that the lockout was connected to my account. I imagine there was a lot of frantic searching through files that didn't exist. A lot of awkward conversations about who exactly this Pauline Marchetti person was and why her credentials seemed to control so much. That's when Preston called me. I let it ring. Listen to his voicemail later. He stumbled through an explanation that somehow made this sound like a minor technical issue. Hey, Pauline. Just following up on some system access questions. Seems like there might be some legacy credentials that need updating. Nothing urgent, but if you could call back when you get a chance, that would be great. Hope the consulting transition is going smoothly. Nothing urgent. The Federal Reserve was asking questions about why a regulated bank couldn't submit its required reports, and he said nothing urgent. I didn't call back. Day 2 was worse, much worse. The Fed had escalated their inquiry. What started as a polite question had become a formal request for documentation. They wanted to understand why our certification system had failed. They wanted evidence that our reporting was accurate. They wanted explanations for discrepancies they'd noticed in our historical submissions. Discrepancies I could have explained in 5 minutes. Discrepancies that looked like fraud if you didn't understand the context. There was a 2015 filing that showed an unusual spike in loan loss provisions. Suspicious if you didn't know we'd been preparing for a specific commercial real estate downturn that I'd identified in our portfolio. There was a 2017 adjustment to our capital calculations that looked like manipulation, perfectly legal if you understood the regulatory accommodation we'd negotiated after acquiring a failed savings and loan. Context. Everything in banking is context. And the only person who had all the context was sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee. Preston tried to handle it himself. I heard about this through Denise, who was now texting me hourly updates with increasingly frantic emojis. He'd found some old compliance manuals I'd written years ago, outdated documentation that described processes we'd changed after the 2018 review. He sent those to the Fed as evidence of our compliance framework. The Fed noticed the inconsistencies immediately. The documents he sent described systems we no longer used. To a regulator. That looks like either incompetence or deception. Neither is good. Worse, he'd included some internal memos that had never been intended for regulators. Documents that discussed our concerns about certain loan classifications. Documents that, taken out of context, suggested we knew we had problems and were hiding them. We weren't hiding anything. Those memos were part of a normal review process. But without me there to explain, they looked damning. Meanwhile, the reporting lockout had triggered secondary issues. Our automated suspicious activity monitoring couldn't file its reports. That's not just an inconvenience. That's a potential violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, the kind of violation that gets people indicted. Our consumer complaint tracking was throwing errors. That meant complaints were piling up without proper documentation. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau takes that very seriously. Our quarterly call report was stuck in draft status, unable to be submitted. Missed that deadline. And the regulators start calculating penalties by the day. The bank was going blind. And the regulators were watching. Day 3 brought lawyers. Lots of lawyers. Preston had finally realized this wasn't something he could charm his way out of. He'd brought in a white shoe law firm from New York, partners billing $2,000 an hour, associates who'd never seen a regional bank's compliance infrastructure. They descended on our offices like a well-dressed plague, boxes of documents, forensic accountants, people in conference rooms asking questions that revealed they didn't understand the answers. One of the partners asked me why our compliance department only had 4 people. I explained that most banks our size had 2, and we were actually well-staffed. He looked at me like I was speaking Martian. Wall Street people don't understand community banking. Different scale, different relationships, different rules. 3 senior managers resigned that week, quietly. Letters citing personal reasons and family obligations. The kind of language people use when they see the ship sinking and want to get their names off the manifest before it goes under. One of them, a woman named Catherine, who'd run our investment advisory unit, sent me a message before she left. You tried to warn them. They should have listened. I'm sorry I didn't say something when they pushed you out. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The time for saying something was before, not after. The board got involved on day 3. Not Preston's father specifically, but enough board members that the family connection wasn't providing cover anymore. The chairman called me personally. His name was Richard Okonkwo. He'd been on the board for 12 years. We'd worked together through the 2012 crisis. He understood, better than most, what I actually did. His voice was strained when he called, the voice of a man watching a situation spiral beyond control. Pauline, I'm calling personally, not through official channels. I need to understand what's happening with our regulatory systems. I told him the truth, simply, clearly, without anger. The systems require authorization from an account that's been deactivated. The authorization can't be restored without someone who understands the architecture. The consultants don't understand the architecture. The documentation doesn't exist because I was the documentation. There was a long pause. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need a proper consulting contract at market rate, full access to the systems I built, a formal acknowledgement that my expertise is required for regulatory compliance, and I need it in writing before I touch anything." He agreed, not happily, but he understood the alternative. The contract they sent was interesting, very interesting. In preparing it, their lawyers had finally done what they should have done months ago. They'd actually looked at our regulatory filings. They'd reviewed the documentation of our compliance systems. They'd traced the history of who had built what and when and why. And they'd discovered something that made Preston Whitmore III very uncomfortable. 32 regulatory filings, that was the number. 32 submissions to federal and state regulators over 20 years, where my name appeared as the certifying officer or primary architect. 32 documents that established me as the authoritative source for our compliance framework. They hadn't noticed before. Why would they? Regulatory filings were legal paperwork, submitted and forgotten. Nobody actually read them except the regulators. And the regulators had assumed the certifying officer was actually in charge of compliance, because I was every filing I'd signed, I'd earned, I'd designed the systems, I'd built the frameworks, I'd sat in meetings with federal examiners explaining why our specific approach was appropriate for our specific situation. I'd negotiated the accommodations that let us operate when other banks were failing. The executives approved things. I made those approvals defensible. There's a difference. Their lawyers figured this out around day 5, right when the Federal Reserve announced they were accelerating their examination. Instead of next quarter, the exam would begin in 2 weeks. Comprehensive review, full documentation requirements, on-site examiners for a minimum of 30 days. The Fed doesn't accelerate examinations because everything is fine. They accelerate when they smell blood. The email from the Fed's lead examiner landed in the chairman's inbox on day 6. Richard forwarded it to me, intentionally this time. "We have identified significant concerns regarding Meridian Trust's compliance infrastructure. Our preliminary review indicates potential gaps in regulatory reporting, certification procedures, and institutional accountability. We require immediate clarification regarding the role, responsibilities, and current status of Ms. Pauline Marchetti, who appears as certifying officer on numerous regulatory submissions. They weren't wrong. When I was the compliance director, everything was clean, documented where it needed to be documented, authorized by the appropriate authority, defensible. But now I was a consultant with deactivated credentials, and all those filings with my name on them were looking very questionable to regulators who specialized in finding problems. The meeting invitation came the next morning. Subject line, urgent regulatory discussion. They'd booked the main boardroom, the one with the mahogany table and the portraits of previous chairmen on the walls, the one they used for annual meetings and major announcements. I dressed carefully, professional, confident. The kind of outfit that says, "I know what I'm worth and I'm not intimidated by your mahogany table and your oil paintings." The chairman was there. Preston was there, looking significantly diminished. His Italian suit was wrinkled. His Swiss watch seemed less impressive. The strategic transformation lead looked like someone whose strategy had transformed into a disaster. Their lawyers were there. Multiple attorneys from multiple firms, expensive attorneys. The kind you hire when the stakes are measured in regulatory sanctions. And at the end of the table, on video conference, were 2 people I didn't recognize. Federal Reserve examiners, already observing. No one offered me coffee. No one made small talk. The chairman just gestured to a chair and said, "Thank you for coming, Pauline." I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. Preston tried to start. Obviously, there's been some confusion about documentation. This is really just an administrative matter. We're confident our compliance framework is sound. One of the Fed examiners cut him off. Her voice was neutral, but carried the weight of regulatory authority. "We've completed our preliminary document review. 32 filings over 20 years list Ms. Marchetti as the certifying officer or system architect. These filings cover capital adequacy reporting, consumer protection compliance, anti-money laundering protocols, and risk management frameworks. She paused. According to your current organizational chart, Ms. Marchetti is listed as an external consultant with no formal role in compliance oversight. Can someone explain this discrepancy? The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been operating a bank without understanding who actually kept it legal. Preston cleared his throat. Ms. Marchetti's role evolved over time. She was primarily administrative support for the compliance function. I spoke for the first time. Administrative support. I let those words hang in the air. What Mr. Whitmore means is that I designed every compliance system this bank uses. I built the regulatory reporting frameworks. I negotiated the supervisory accommodations that allowed us to survive 3 financial crises. For 20 years, I was the reason this bank passed its examinations. I looked at Preston, and then 2 months ago, someone decided I was organizational overhead, strategic workforce right-sizing. That was the phrase, wasn't it? Preston's face went through several colors. He opened his mouth to respond. The chairman's hand landed on his arm, a warning. Stop talking. The Fed examiner nodded slowly. Ms. Marchetti, we'd like to schedule a separate interview. Our examination will require clarity on compliance ownership and regulatory accountability. She looked at the chairman. Until we have that clarity, we're placing Meridian Trust under enhanced supervision. All major transactions will require Federal Reserve approval, effective immediately. Enhanced supervision. That's regulatory speak for we think you might be a danger to the financial system. It's one step below conservatorship, one step above being allowed to operate normally. It's the kind of designation that destroys stock prices and triggers depositor panic. I stood to leave. The chairman caught my arm. Pauline, please, we can resolve this. Whatever you need, name it. I looked at him, at Preston, at the lawyers calculating damages, at the board members who suddenly remembered I existed. I want a proper employment contract, full restoration of my title and responsibilities, back pay for the months I was misclassified, and I want a formal acknowledgement, in writing, of my role in building this bank's compliance infrastructure. The chairman nodded. Done. One more thing. I turned to Preston. I want a written apology, addressed to me personally and copied to the board, for the way my transition was handled. Preston's jaw tightened. His family's name was on buildings in this city. People like him didn't apologize to people like me, but the Federal Reserve was watching, and his father couldn't buy his way out of regulatory sanctions. Fine, he muttered. I smiled, small, tired, and satisfied. Good. I'll begin the remediation work tomorrow. The examination should take about 3 weeks once I have full access restored. 3 weeks. Preston's voice cracked. We're under enhanced supervision now. I gathered my things. Then I suggest you get those documents ready tonight. The paperwork was signed by 11 p.m., the employment contract, the title restoration, the written acknowledgement, the formal apology, which Preston had clearly dictated through clenched teeth. I read it 3 times, just to appreciate every painful word. The remediation work took exactly as long as I said it would. Not because I was slow, because I was thorough. I documented everything, every system, every process, every piece of institutional knowledge that had lived only in my head for 2 decades. The Federal Reserve examiners worked alongside me. Professional, respectful. They understood, better than our own executives, what I actually did when it was done. Meridian Trust had something it had never had before: real documentation, proper succession planning, a compliance infrastructure that didn't depend on one person's memory. The examination concluded with a satisfactory rating, not excellent, too many gaps in historical documentation for that, but satisfactory, enough to lift the enhanced supervision, enough to save the bank. The examiners wrote in their report that our compliance infrastructure was fundamentally sound. that the issues had been caused by management disruption, not systemic failures, that the bank had demonstrated appropriate corrective action. Appropriate corrective action. That's regulatory speak for you. Fix the problem we told you to fix. It's the best outcome you can hope for once the regulators are involved. The stock price recovered. Mostly. We lost about 15% of our value during the crisis. Roughly $200 million in market capitalization. Some institutional investors had sold during the enhanced supervision period. They didn't come back. That's what Preston's strategic workforce rightsizing had cost the shareholders, $200 million and 3 weeks of regulatory terror, plus the legal fees, plus the consulting fees, plus the reputational damage that's harder to quantify but easier to feel. Our biggest depositor, a regional hospital system, moved half their operating accounts to a competitor. $230 million in deposits. Gone. Because they'd read about the regulatory issues and decided they couldn't risk their money with a bank under enhanced supervision. The domino effects continued for months. A commercial real estate developer we'd worked with for 15 years took his next project to a different lender. Said he couldn't explain to his investors why he was banking with a firm that had regulatory problems. Trust is easy to destroy, hard to rebuild. Preston had burned through 20 years of relationship capital in 3 months. I received a significant settlement, back pay for the months I'd been misclassified, damages for the way the transition was handled, a consulting arrangement that would continue as long as I wanted it, plus a seat on the compliance committee of the board. The lawyers had advised the bank to be generous. The alternative was a lawsuit they'd probably lose, a lawsuit that would become public. A lawsuit that would make the regulatory problems look like the bank's fault instead of one man's arrogance. Not bad for someone they'd classified as organizational overhead. Preston Whitmore III resigned 2 months later. Family reasons, according to the press release. Spending more time with family. The classic excuse for executives who've been pushed out quietly. His father quietly stepped down from the board the same week. The family name had become a liability instead of an asset. Sometimes generational wealth can't buy your way out of consequences. Last I heard, Preston is running a fintech startup. Something about disrupting traditional banking. He's raised $12 million in venture capital from investors who apparently don't do background checks. I hope his investors check his references carefully. I hope someone asks why he left his last job. The chairman sent me a handwritten note after the examination ended. 3 sentences on heavy cream paper, the kind of stationery people use when they mean what they're writing. You saved this bank. I should have protected you. I won't forget. I framed that note, hung it in my office, my real office, on the executive floor, with a window that looks out over downtown, the same view Preston used to have. I'm still at Meridian Trust, different role now, Chief Compliance Officer, the title I should have had years ago. The title I'd earned 100 times over but never received because I didn't have the right name or the right connections. I report directly to the board, not to anyone named Whitmore, not to anyone who thinks compliance is overhead. I have a voice in every major decision. I have authority to stop things that don't make sense. The work is the same as it always was. Keeping the systems running, translating regulations into processes, making sure the numbers add up and the examiners stay satisfied, building the infrastructure that nobody sees until it breaks. But now people listen when I explain why something matters. Now my expertise is an asset instead of overhead. Now I have a seat at the table instead of a corner by the door. I've made changes since I came back. Built a proper documentation system. Hired people who will be able to do my job when I'm gone. Created succession plans for every critical function. Made sure no one person is a single point of failure again. Not because I'm worried about job security, because it's the right thing to do, because a bank shouldn't depend on one person's memory, because the next Pauline Marchetti shouldn't have to prove her value by being indispensable. Last week, a young analyst asked me how I'd learned so much about compliance systems. She was maybe 25, bright, ambitious. Just started in our regulatory reporting group. The kind of person Preston would have called a high potential resource. The kind of person I was. Once. A long time ago. I told her the truth. I paid attention when nobody thought I was listening. I stayed curious about systems everyone else ignored. I documented everything, even when nobody asked me to. And when people underestimated me, I let them. Because there's power in being invisible. Right up until the moment they realize they need you. She nodded. Wrote something in her notebook. Said she'd remember that. I hope she does. I hope she builds something worth protecting. I hope she finds mentors who recognize her value. And I hope, if anyone ever tries to make her unnecessary, she remembers what I learned. Silence isn't surrender. It's preparation. It's documentation. It's building a record that speaks for itself. Then I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and watched the city lights through my office window. The view is better from up here. The corner office they gave me after the examination. The one Preston used to occupy. The one with the mahogany desk and the credenza and the little refrigerator I've never used. Funny how things work out. I thought about Preston, wherever he is now, probably pitching investors on his disruption platform, probably explaining why traditional banking needs to be transformed, probably convinced he was right and everyone else was wrong. Some people never learn. They just fail upward until gravity catches them. I thought about all the invisible workers in banks everywhere, the compliance officers and accountants and operations specialists, the ones who keep financial systems running while executives take credit, the ones who remember why certain rules exist, the ones who can explain what regulations actually mean instead of just quoting them, the ones who are too experienced to fire and too quiet to promote. We see everything. We remember everything. We document everything. And someday, someone will make the mistake of thinking we don't matter, underestimated, overlooked, essential. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and some lessons you teach. Big thanks for sticking around, you beautiful guardians of the bottom line. Subscribe to keep the ledgers balanced and the auditors satisfied. Like, comment, share with anyone who's ever been treated like overhead. Share with anyone who's been pushed aside for being too experienced. Share with anyone who knows what it's like to be invisible. Because trust me, there are always more stories where this came from. And somewhere out there, another quiet professional is documenting everything, waiting for their moment, keeping the receipts, building the record that will speak for itself, just like I did. The numbers always add up eventually, even when management doesn't want them to. Especially when management doesn't want them to.